thank you. So my name's Rory. I'm a PhD student at UCL, and I also, for quite a few years, have been writing about sound and music and related things. So this is kind of a really nice opportunity for me to sort of bridge some of those interests. So thank you for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. So I'm going to talk about some of the work that our group's been doing on monitoring ecosystems using sound and on developing new machine learning techniques to do a better job of that, with the disclaimer that I'm not a computer scientist or a machine learning specialist. I'm an ecologist, so it's not going to be super kind of technical, a lot of what I'm going to talk about, but I guess the idea that I really want to get across is that there's a load of really interesting places where new tech development and sort of new computer science development can interface with ecology and trying to understand how the planet is changing under human pressures. So I guess that's kind of what I'm really trying to get across with the talk today. I'll start just off with a general introduction to why we're interested in monitoring ecosystems at all. And then where ecologists can kind of benefit from engaging with new technologies and from sensors and machine learning, and talk about some of our work in that area. And then finally I'll talk about some work that our group's been doing to develop smart sensors, so like real-time acoustic sensor networks. So this is all for bats, which is what our group works on, but you could conceivably extend this to pretty much any species that makes noises that you can identify. So it's pretty flexible. So I guess first of all, some acknowledgements. When I say we, I'm really talking about this giant group of people and organizations that have been working on a lot of these projects for more than 10 years. So we've had sort of funding and partnerships with loads of organizations that have been involved in doing this. Specifically, just to mention Kate Jones, who's the professor at UCL, who's the head of our group, Oisin Makeda, Ella Browning, and Ali Fairbrass and Michael Furman, who've all been kind of really central to a lot of the work that I'm going to talk about. Why are we interested in monitoring species and ecosystems? This is kind of the ultimate question that underlies all of what I'm going to talk about. Partly in the most practical way, because we have policy commitments around that. So we're signed up to the UN Convention on Biological Diversity, which at the last meeting in 2010, we agreed a set of targets related to preventing biodiversity loss. So this is preventing species from going extinct and from declining in ecosystems. So this particular target, I think, sums up the need quite nicely. So by 2020, the extinction of known threatened species has been prevented, and their conservation status, particularly of those most in decline, has been improved and sustained. So we can only really get a sense for how well we're doing at getting anywhere near that target if we're actually monitoring species and watching how they're responding to the pressures we're putting them under. So with that in mind, I'm going to show you some depressing graphs about how we're doing. So this is from the WWF Living Planet report, which is this year's. This was last year's one. It comes out every 2 years as an updated document. And so this is the kind of headline figure, really. So you'll probably have seen this in the news. So this is called the Living Planet Index. It's essentially a composite trend of species populations from monitored species, so more than 3,000 species monitored since 1970. So essentially we take all of their population trends, how are they doing, squash them together to give us some kind of broader indicator of what biodiversity is doing. And as you can see, it's looking pretty bad. So there's been a 58% decline in those populations since 1970. So that's individuals within those populations. So there's a lot of species declining globally. Another perspective on this is a really interesting project called the Predicts project, which is looking at, again, how intact biodiversity is in different ecosystems. So this is a global map of the estimated intactness of ecological communities. So essentially, black and red means bad, blue means good. Most of the globe is not doing so well. So this shows basically the proportion of the original species remaining in that ecosystem compared to what it would be like if it hadn't been disturbed. So you can see a huge amount of the planet is affected by human footprint. And so the kind of broader reason why monitoring this is important then is because there's a lot of things that ecosystems do for us. I mean, I guess all of you are well aware of the sort of impacts of climate change and all sorts of aspects of human existence. The same kind of thing applies to ecosystems. We depend on them for pretty much everything: pollination, water purification, climate regulation, all of these things that if the ecosystems degrade beyond a certain point, we could potentially lose. So there's that practical aspect to monitoring them as well. So with that in mind, I think, what I'd like to get across in this talk really is about why ecologists and computer scientists, why it's a productive relationship for ecologists, computer scientists and tech people to work together. And I guess the kind of key point here, as it often is, relates to data. So as global change ecologists, as people that are studying what's happening globally, we're essentially dealing with larger and larger and larger data sets, but especially for ecological systems, which are very hard to observe. They're also really messy. So we kind of need computational and statistical tools that let us process these kinds of data sets and actually pull out information that's salient, which isn't a very easy feat when you're looking at data sets like this. So this is the Global Biodiversity Information Facility. So this is an online database, a sort of collaborative database. And it's got more than 800 million species records. So each one of the points here is where a species has been observed between 1600 and the present day. But so essentially each yellow point is where an observation is, and the red areas are where there are more observations. So you can kind of already see that there are all of these biases and gaps in the data. Some areas are a lot better studied than others. But we need data like this to tell us where species are now and to try and essentially infer where they might be in future once we do even more damage to the planet and the ecosystems they depend on. And so similarly, to actually try and get a handle on this, we're also working with data from loads of different monitoring technologies. So this is satellite data. So this is forest cover loss measured from the Landsat satellite. So this has been processed using some kind of machine learning, computer vision type algorithm to pull out changes to the satellite photos to give some sense of where forest is being lost. And again, not a great picture. The red essentially shows where forest has been lost since 2000. And some of you might be familiar from camera traps if you've watched things like Planet Earth. So those are the remote cameras that you just strap to a tree or another feature in the landscape, and they've got a little infrared sensor in them that picks up when something moves past, triggers and takes a photo. So we use these to, say, monitor populations of big wildlife, like this thing, whatever it is, maybe a wildebeest there. Yeah. But so, as you can imagine, if you put these out for several months, you collect tens of thousands of photos. So somebody needs to go through those, normally by hand. And if you're putting out 100 of these cameras, that number multiplies very quickly to something that's very difficult to deal with. So there's been a lot of interest in using computer vision type techniques to actually go through these photos to learn the distinguishing features of different species and pull them out automatically. So there's this paper from earlier in the year which is worth taking a look at, which used data from the Snapshot Serengeti project, which is pretty cool. And so relatedly then is the stuff that I'll talk about for the rest of this, which is the same kind of idea but with acoustics. So we can put these sensors out in the field listening to ecosystems and essentially listening for what species are there and what they're doing. But as you can imagine, if you're putting out loads and loads of sensors listening potentially 24/7 or for a few hours a day, you end up with huge amounts of audio data, and attempting to listen through that to find what you're interested in is a Sisyphean task when you're continually collecting data. So I wanted to give you guys a bit of a sense, I guess, for what we can actually pull out of this data. So these are just a couple of recordings that will hopefully work. And they're a bit quiet. Both sides. So this is a soprano pipistrelle, which has actually been slowed down by a factor of 10. So normally they vocalize in the ultrasonic range, so we wouldn't normally hear this. So in order to actually hear it, we have to stretch the recording. So there's two types of calls in here. You've got the high-pitched ones, the continual pulse, which is an echolocation pulse. So basically they send a pulse out into the environment, it bounces off features, ricochets back to them, and then they get a sense of what's going on in the environment. And then this lower kind of cheeping one that comes out a lot more loudly is a social call. So that's essentially them singing to each other. And then this other one is something entirely different. So this is audible range rather than ultrasound. So that's a flock of swifts, kind of familiar summer sound. But so both of these were recorded in my garden last summer. And I think this is kind of like a very simple but quite nice illustration of the fact that you put these recorders out and you can immediately pull out quite a bit of information about what's going on. So you've got these bats and these birds there, and you can also tell that the bats aren't just flying through, they're also socializing. So you can pull out this kind of data, and if you imagine extrapolating this to a whole network of sensors throughout an environment, you can pull all sorts of really interesting information out about what species are there and what they're doing. So this has been kind of in development for, I don't know, 15 or 20 years in various different areas, but one of the main challenges here is that the sensors that we use for this are typically super expensive, especially the ultrasound ones, compared to other tech like camera traps. And this issue that they collect so much audio, being able to, you're basically limited by what you can do by how much you've collected. So since it's a tech thing, I just brought some tech. So this is a bat logger, which is the thing that I use to make that recording of the bat you just heard. And it's about 1,500 quid. And this is maybe average or definitely less expensive than some of the kind of ultrasound detectors you can use. It's pretty good. No, it's great actually, but it's pricey. So scaling up with these things is difficult, especially as I was saying to somebody before, the money in ecology and conservation isn't great compared to a lot of areas of science. So this is something we're working with at the moment, which has been developed by some collaborators of our group in Oxford and Southampton. It's called an audio moth, and it's smaller than a credit card, and it costs 40 quid. And it does a pretty similar job. I mean, it does the same job. It can pick up bats. The firmware on there is good enough to detect ultrasound, and the microphone's good enough, but it's essentially a smartphone microphone. But so these things are based around just little printed circuit boards, so you can kind of mass produce them and scale up quite quickly. These things have only just become available, but then I think this really just increases this question of what we do with all the data, because we can put loads of these out now. Ella, who's in the audience here, is planning to do that. And then we're going to have thousands and thousands of hours, and we have to do something with it, which is where this broader question of developing the tools comes in. So we're interested in monitoring bat populations because they're cool and interesting, also because they're potentially quite a good indicator species, so they're really sensitive to human pressures. So you monitor a bat population, you hopefully get some sense of how the broader ecosystem is doing. So the background work to this is the Indicator Bats program, which was started by Kate Jones, who's the head of our group, in 2006. So this was a big citizen science project, so getting volunteers involved in doing bat population monitoring across Europe. And the idea is that people get in a car, they stick a bat detector to the top, and they drive through the landscape, and they collect a recording, and then they send it to us. So we've got this massive database, thousands of hours of data, that potentially contains really useful and interesting information about what bats in Europe have been doing over the last 10 years or so. But we need to get the information out of it. So the way to do this is the sort of schematic of how you would get the actual information out. Is you go from your raw audio signal at the top, which is what you've recorded, and then you produce a spectrogram from that using a Fourier type analysis. So this produces essentially an image of the sound. So you've got the frequency on the y-axis, time on the x, and then individual sounds show up as these bright blotches. So then what you need to do in order to pull out the ecological information we're interested in is first detect the signals that you're interested in within the recording. So there's going to be a lot of the recording that has nothing of interest in it. And then you want to classify them to species. So what made those calls? And in general, you do that by pulling out some kind of useful distinguishing information, so we call it features, from the call. Something about its shape, its volume, all those kinds of things that tell you something about what species made it. So doing this by hand, as you can imagine, is super time consuming. But it's also like a really automatable process. This is essentially the kind of process that voice recognition software, lots of computer vision type software does, right? It detects things and then it tells you what they are. So there's a good reason to think this is a fairly automatable process. But the challenge that we have with bats is that it's not like we've got the kind of data sets that you can train stuff on for human things, right? I mean, like we've got the entire history of recorded human language to train kind of human voice recognition software on, or the whole of Google image search to train image recognition algorithms on. But we don't have that for bats at all. So we need a really big training data set of calls to train these algorithms on that up until recently we didn't have. So again, we turned to citizen science, this time online. So we partnered up with this really great organisation called the Zooniverse, which I really encourage you to check them out. They're an online citizen science platform. You can go on and help people with all sorts of different types of data analysis. And so essentially, we did a project called Bat Detective, which encourages users to log on and give us a hand listening through all this iBats data that we have and find where the calls are and label them so we can produce a training data set. And so this is an example of what you're shown when you go onto the Bat Detective site. And the sound here is weird. you should hear something, and you kind of just hear muffled fuzz. But so normally you should hear a little cheeping here. But so you listen to this clip, and then you find the sounds of interest. You as a member of the public, anybody who wants to be involved, and you label the sounds that are interesting on the spectrogram, and then you tell us what you think they are with reference to a key. So here these are search phase echolocation calls, so they're the calls that the bat uses to move around. And so we've built up a really amazing data set with this. So since 2012, when it started, we've had more than 8,000 people involved. They've classified more than 110 hours of audio from 12 countries, and found about 17,000 bat calls, which split out into different types of calls, which is cool as well because we can start thinking about training algorithms to pick out different behaviors. So we've got these search echolocation calls and the social calls that they sing to each other, and then these sonar pings that they do when they're feeding. So we have this, and then we can use it to train a detector to do this in an automated way for us. So this was work that Oshin Makeda from our group led on, and we've just had a paper, we put it on bioRxiv earlier in the year, and it's in review at the moment, essentially looking at training this detector and looking at its performance. So essentially what the CNN does once it's been trained on the training data set is it runs through. That was fun, yeah. It wasn't so obvious with the ambient sound recordings, yeah. So it sends a sliding window along the recording and assesses within each little area that it sits in, is there a bat call there or not? And so this wiggly line at the top is essentially the continuous probability of there being a bat call in audio space. And when it crosses over this threshold, which is this dotted line, the computer says, oh, there's a bat call there. And so you can see it's here, it's done a pretty good job. It's picked out the 4 big ones, and it's also picked out the little one in the background between the first 2 calls. They all come up, the real calls are labeled as green lines here. So the neat thing about using a CNN, so like a deep learning based approach rather than previous approaches like artificial neural networks that we've used before for this stuff, is that you can pass them the image data directly. So rather than extracting features from the calls beforehand and then passing it to the network, you just give it the images, and then it just learns the distinguishing information directly from them in the same way that a computer vision type algorithm would. Which we found, and this is by far the most complicated thing I'm going to show you, which we found really improves their performance. So this is a precision recall curve. This essentially looks at how well the algorithm is performing on a known data set. So we've put together a data set where we know where all the bat calls are. Then we run the algorithm on it, and we look at how well it's performing on it. And so essentially recall along the bottom measures how many of the known calls you find, and precision tells you how many false detections you've got. So the optimum is to get up into the top right corner where you're picking up all of the ones that you want, and you're minimizing the false ones, which if you're thinking about consolidation is really important because you don't want to detect something when it's not there. And so you can see these 2 CNNs that we've produced, the black and the blue line, push much further up into that corner than a lot of these other algorithms, most of which are proprietary type softwares. So we're performing a lot better than a lot of these other detection tools, and they're also closed source. So from a scientific perspective, it's really useful to actually know what the tool is doing. Cool. So then this fits into this open source audio pipeline that we're developing at the moment. So as I was saying, this automatable process. So the detection algorithm then sits at C, this point in the middle. The feature extraction and signal classification stuff, we've already published a couple of papers, or our group has already published a couple of papers on. One's using a random forest and the other one's using an artificial neural network. But more recently, we've also been working on a CNN-based, or a convolutional neural network-based classifier as well that takes those detected calls and identifies them to species for the same reason that the image, being able to pass the image directly tends to give a better performance. So that's the pipeline. And lastly, then, I just wanted to give you guys a sense of where we're using it. So this is a really cool project that I wasn't directly involved in. It was other members of our group were, but I just think it's such a nice project that I think it's a really good way to illustrate what we can start doing with these tools. And so it's a project called Nature Smart Cities, which was launched earlier in the year, which essentially the aim was to try and put together a real-time smart bat sensing network in London. So we put up a network of sensors, and the idea is to detect bat activity in real time. And so this is essentially a much nicer and slicker version of the pipeline that I showed you that I did. So this is that you've got a bat calling at the far left, and then it's picked up by a detector, stored as a WAV file, which is then has the detector and classifier algorithm run on it, and then at the end it spits you out a classification with a probability attached to it. So how likely it is that it's that species that it thinks it is. So this was work that was led mainly by Ali Fairbrass and Sarah Gallagher at Intel. So yeah, basically all the work that I'm going to talk about now is stuff that they did. So essentially the idea was to use, so this was a collaboration with Intel. So the idea was to use Intel's Edison board, which is like a little kind of microcomputer, to build a smart bat sensor. So they were connected up to an ultrasonic microphone, and then in collaboration with the computer scientists in our group, essentially worked to develop these algorithms that we've produced so that they run on a really little computer like this, which I understand was a non-trivial challenge. Yeah, so after this probably took 9 months, I guess, or something to develop, I think. But then they were built into these echo boxes, which are all wired up to the network, and then put out across the Olympic Park. So this is the Queen Elizabeth Olympic Park in Stratford. So if you go there now, you can wander through and you can actually see these boxes. And so they're out listening. The bats are all hibernating now, but over the course of the summer, they were being picked up. And so this is a really cool aspect. So we built, or they built, an online interface that anybody can go and look at that shows you what's going on in real time in the park. So this is a video here of each one of those white dots is a sensor, and you can see them flashing as they pick up bats. So you could go to this with your phone or with your computer during the summer, and some nights you see a huge amount going on. So I think this is a really cool example of actually being able to not only use this technology to pick up bats, but also to tell us something about where they are and what they're doing. So throughout the summer, sensor number 7 in the middle, it has the big red blob around it, so that the size of the red blob shows you how much has been going on around that sensor. There's a bat roost right next to it, so this one kind of like vastly outweighs the rest of the ones in the park. But there are whole areas of the park the bats are using on particular nights, areas that they're not using on other nights. So it's just a really nice example of being able to look at something like this in real time, and from an ecological perspective, there's more questions you can start to ask. So this is really my last slide, but so this is the per night bat detections throughout the summer since the network was launched in July. So there's a huge amount of variation night by night, and we still don't really understand that much about the things that bats like. We know that there are particular weather conditions they tend not to go out in, but this doesn't seem to correlate very much to those kind of weather conditions. So maybe it's related to sporting events or nights when there's a lot of people in the park, or fireworks, or I don't know, who knows. But so it's a really, I like the idea that we could start to pick out some more information about actually the way that people and bats are kind of cohabiting in the space using a network like this. What are we doing that's affecting the way that they're using the space? And maybe what could we do that would improve it? Oh yeah, so I forgot I added this. So this is the temperature, which doesn't really correlate in any meaningful way whatsoever to where the bats are. So this is a project for somebody else. So yeah, I guess just to summarize really, hopefully I've kind of given a bit of a sense for the fact that these kinds of sensing technologies are really improving our capacity to assess and monitor how species and ecosystems are responding to the kind of pressures we're putting on them, and that these emerging machine learning and computer vision tools are actually provide sort of really useful things to let us deal with the data glut, which is ever growing. And increasingly the ecologists need computer scientists and tech people. But I think also there's a good argument for it being the other way around as well. So we've got these sort of very messy real-world data sets that challenge these technologies. And it can be quite, from my experience of talking to people that work from the computer science side, it's an interesting way of seeing where your algorithm breaks. Where does it not work? And ecological data are messy and they're biased and they break everything. And so lastly, like from me as somebody that tends to be quite skeptical about the way that these technologies tend to be used, I quite like the way that it's taking a lot of these technologies which are often used to surveil people or are being put to sort of fairly nefarious ends and actually trying to do something that could potentially help us coexist a bit better on the planet. So yeah, thanks to everyone that worked on this stuff. I was really just the mouthpiece for a lot of it. And yeah, all the funders and partner organisations and all of the citizen scientists who helped with the iBats and bat detector projects and actually made all of this happen. Cool. Thank you.
Thanks, Rory. That was fascinating.
Oh, yeah,
We've got about
questions,
three
yeah.
minutes if anyone's got a question.
So those sensors are only sensitive only to the ultrasound sounds or any spectrum of any frequency?
These little ones?
Yeah.
So these actually go the full way. So you could sense audible range sound with these as well.
Yeah, so is it something that you plan to kind of share that audio with all other research teams that work on other animals?
So these are open source, and they've basically been released as circuit board schematics on the AudioMoth website.
But do you share like your sensors for the data, for example?
Oh, the data.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is an interesting discussion actually, and it's going on a lot in the acoustics field around. So do you mean kind of sharing training data so that people can kind of work with these, or do you mean more broadly sharing the kind of data that we collect?
Sharing the audio with other research groups so that you could observe not only bats but other animals in the ecosystem too.
Yeah. No. Absolutely. So there is, I suppose, some progress towards that. I would say that the field a lot of the time is fragmented. There's a lot of discussion going on in the acoustics field in general about how to do a better job of sharing data. One of the challenges is that it's big. Like audio data, especially ultrasonic data, takes up a lot of space. So uploading it to a database like the GBIF database that I showed you is not really very plausible. So it's thinking about how to build an infrastructure that lets people share data better. But it definitely goes on at the level of research groups. So we have collaborators that have used this bat data to also pull out information about how insects that vocalize in the ultrasound are doing. And I know there's similar projects. So Cornell University in the States have a big bioacoustics and ecoacoustics lab. And so a lot of what they do repurposes a lot of the data that they collect to ask different questions. Yeah.
So, looking at the map you had from the Olympic Park,
yeah.
the sort of the top of it, there were quite a few of the detectors next to each other.
Yeah.
Sort of four or five next to each other. It seems that a lot of those might be getting duplicate hits from the same bat. So, like humans have distinct voice prints. Is there any way of weeding out duplicates, which would also help you cut down your data?
It's a real challenge.
I don't know how similar bats are to
yeah, no, it's really tough. So the thing I should say about these is this is what ecologists call a random stratified sample. So basically this is stratified by habitat. So we've essentially run a random selection procedure on the sensors so that this samples every habitat in the park. So that's why they kind of fall out the way they do. It's really hard. Identifying individual bats from their calls is not something that people have figured out how to do yet. It seems like it wouldn't necessarily... It can happen for other animals. There are species that we can pull out individual ID from. So in general, it's species that have an obvious vocal repertoire. So some bird species and dolphins and things like that often have kind of quite individual signatures. So in a way, maybe those are used to identify each other. So the calls that we're working on with the bats at the moment are echolocation calls, and so those are super functional. So essentially, those have evolved to be very, very stereotyped because the bat moves through the environment and it actually uses those to navigate. So they're very similar across individuals to our understanding. So it might be possible to do it with some of the social calls, for example. So if they sing in a different way, if their repertoires differ. But actually that's not really very well known. And this kind of goes back to your point about data sharing. One of the big problems we have is that we don't have very good libraries of calls recorded for bats. Either they've been collected by researchers who aren't that keen on sharing them, or we just haven't really collected very good ones. So yeah. But I think that's a frontier that people are interested in, for sure.